Welcome to the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast, the show designed to serve you up evidence-based sports nutrition advice from the experts. Hi, I'm your host Taryn, accredited practicing dietitian, advanced sports dietitian, and founder of Dietitian Approved. Listen as I break down the latest evidence to give you practical, easy to digest strategies to train hard, recover faster, and perform at your best. You have so much potential, and I want to help you unlock that with the power of nutrition. Let's get into it. Now, my guest today needs absolutely no introduction. She's one of the world's most successful triathletes of all time, with an 18-year professional racing career under her belt, both in the ITU circuit and full distance events. It is Liz Blatchford. Welcome.
Hey, Taryn. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
You're welcome. Can I go through your racing history? Are you going to be cool if you listen to that?
Oh, yeah. Why not? Feed my ego.
As a retired athlete now, I think it's pretty cool to still highlight what you did. You started racing in 2000 in the ITU circuit.
Oh, my goodness. That's a really long time ago.
Makes you feel old. Makes me feel old thinking back to 2000. And then you transitioned to long course in 2012, where you won your first 70.3 race at Boulder and again in Cozumel that year. And then the next year went on to win Busselton 70.3 and your first Ironman at Cairns. You topped off that success with your first Ironman World Champs in Kona and managed a third place in that, which is just amazing, and ended up racing Kona 4 times over the subsequent years. You won Ironman Cairns 3 years in a row from 2013 to 2015, and now are living up the retirement life. You were inducted into the Ironman Hall of Fame last year in 2022 to top off a pretty epic career.
Thank you, Taryn. That was a lovely introduction and a nice little look back on some of the highlights of my very long career in the sport.
A really long and prosperous career, which is amazing. One of the things I want to talk to you about today, sorry to kind of dredge you back into triathlon life, but you were one of the first Ironman athletes that I ever heard of that was chewing through a heap of carbohydrate on the bike in an Ironman. You worked with awesome legend sports dietitian and my old boss at Triathlon Australia, Greg Cox. And I remember him saying, just like in conversation, that you were feeling hungry on the bike and you're eating 120 grams of carbs an hour. And he was like, this is just insane.
It's funny. I know that you mentioned that when we, first connected, and I was actually like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was so out there. I definitely did not realize that at the time. Now, as I get more into my coaching, I am definitely realizing that. But yeah, at the time, as a short course ITU athlete, nutrition is definitely not as big a role in your racing. And then when I moved to Ironman, I was guided by Coxie. And as you just mentioned, my first Ironman, I followed the plan, and I can't remember where it was, between 100 and 150 kilometers. And I'm like, I need more fuel than this, and just started grabbing bananas from the aid stations and shoving them in. Gave that feedback to Coxie. And then we dialed up my carb intake for the next Ironman, and then dialed it up again, I think a couple more times, until, yes, we landed at that 2 grams of carbs per kilogram per hour on the bike, which, yes, I am now knowing that I'm coaching other people that it was way up there. But at the time, it was just kind of what I needed.
Yeah, and amazing. Did you ever do any metabolic testing actually to know what your carbohydrate oxidation rates were, fat oxidation rates were when you were exercising at all?
Short answer, no. But I guess just from those everyday comparisons, I knew I always consumed a lot of food. And like, I know a lot of athletes do, and we all train a lot, we all need to consume a lot, but just comparing like for like with my training partners, my female training partners on similar training plans, I did generally consume a fair bit more than the next person.
Yeah, and that's not a bad thing. You've got to fuel for performance, right? Food is fuel.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you remember what you started with as your fueling strategy with Coxie, and then how that built up over that time?
Oh, I should have looked that up, shouldn't I, before this? I'd say he started probably between the 1.2 and 1.5 grams per kilogram. So I think that would have had me around 80 to 90 grams per hour. But yeah, that's at that level, I ended up hungry and grabbing bananas. So yeah, we probably put it up 10 to 15 grams each race until we ended up at that 120 from memory. It is a while ago now. I think 2013 to 2014, that was the period we were playing with that and increasing it.
Yeah, amazing. And how did you do that? How did you consume 120 grams of carbs an hour in an Ironman event? Like something like Kona, how do you do that physically? What sort of products are you using and what did you like at that time?
predominantly gels. I had a few different sponsors over the time and would use their different gels. Like they were all fairly standard type gels. So I guess another good thing about myself was I didn't feel like I had many negative impacts from changing fuels, whereas a lot of people would hate to use what's on course and that sort of thing. I kind of just grab anything and shove it in and not really have any issues with it. So I was quite lucky in that aspect. So definitely gels. And I do remember before each Ironman laying out how many gels, and I think it was upward of 20 that I would consume in any given Ironman. But there was also, Coxie got this formula for adding, is it maltodextrin? Just like basically pure sugar to my electrolyte drink. You know, your electrolyte drinks, your Gatorade or whatever it is, normally tastes pretty sweet. And then we'd be like shoving scoops of this pure sugar into my bottles as well. And they would be a little bit sickly sweet, but I'd sip on those and then sip on water between, and then the gels every 20 to 30 minutes as well.
Coxie is a pretty good make concoctions for whatever you need with random powders and things like that. All evidence-based, of course, but it might have been fructose powder, depending on what gels you were using to bump you up to that level of fueling. Do you remember?
He used to just call it Dex.
Okay, could be maltodextrin.
Maltodextrin. And the funny thing was when he told me to go get maltodextrin, I'm like, where do I get this from? He told me to go to a brewer, like a
beer brewer.
A beer brewer, no, like their supply company. And I walked into this tiny brewery supply shop in Palm Beach somewhere and had to ask for maltodextrin, I think it was. That's what we're determining. And they're like, oh, what are you buying this for? And I'm like, not making beer. That was part of my nutrition plan to bump up that carb intake.
It's so good. And so you were doing that before that was cool, before that was like trending, before we had research papers in elite mountain marathon runners that are fueling that aggressively. You know, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to chat to you, pick your brain, because you were way ahead of that curve, and amazing for a more petite female to be able to just digest and absorb that amount of carbohydrate while racing in a really hot environment at high intensity.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing I would say in response to that is that, I don't know, I just kept things really simple and relied on the people around me. So I used people like Coxie because they were the best in their field, and I probably didn't follow the trends or know what was what. And I just trusted those professionals, and if it worked, it worked. So I wasn't really aware that that was a trend, or now sort of in later years, now that I'm getting into my coaching, and I definitely, obviously I'm advising other people more and doing more reading myself, and yeah, aware of that research that, you know, is saying that these best performances are going to come from people that can handle these huge amounts of carb intake. So yeah, I guess I put two and two together, but not necessarily straight away.
Would you have said you had a fairly high carbohydrate diet outside of training?
Yeah, like I think I mentioned, I did have a high carbohydrate diet. I never really restricted my diet. Maybe that was partly what we're talking about. Like I had a high metabolism, never had the need to strip weight. So just felt like I had this need to take on a lot of carbohydrate, and I always did. And then when it came to long course racing, I had I think it was good advice early on from my coach, Matt Steinmetz, and he was all about training my gut. So in training, very rarely would we do calorie restricted training, but very often what we would do is race fuel, and he called it training my gut. So getting used to taking on that large amount of carbohydrate and getting the stomach comfortable, and even just feeling comfortable having that sort of level of fullness and being able to push hard with that level of fullness. And you can probably talk a lot more about this, Taryn, but yeah, I sort of felt like the more I did that, the more I could take.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, gut training ahead of the curve in a way. Literature always takes 5-10 years to catch up from what athletes are doing in practice, I find. And I think it's really important to just explore things and test things, and tweak and evolve it for yourself over time. But it is really individual. And yeah, like coaching athletes yourself and me working with age group athletes, there's not many people I'd give 120 grams of carbs an hour, but you're like a well-oiled machine. You're this high performance engine, and it's like stoking the fire in the way. Sometimes the more fuel we throw at training, the more fuel we throw at racing, the better we are at digesting and absorbing and then using that as a fuel source. So it's really nice and refreshing to hear a female say that when we kind of have this very carb restrictive, carbs are evil, carbs are bad type mindset in the sport at the moment. Did you do anything weird and wonderful for gut training? Like I know athletes back in the 80s and 90s used to do things like eat hot dogs and then go and run hard. Did you do anything weird or considered weird, or just lots and lots of gels and sports products during training?
Sometimes the gels and sports products, but if I'm honest, after an Ironman, would not want to see a gel or a sports drink for a long time and feel like my teeth were rotting out of my head, but could take a lot of carbs in other ways. So I did probably have iron guts of a sort. I would stop and drink like a 600 ml iced coffee and eat a carrot cake and then keep riding, and that would sit fine in my stomach. So, but yeah, there would be sessions like probably 2 or 3 leading into an Ironman where I'd do specific race fuel, but I think a bit like everything else, I didn't want to make myself too sick of those gels and whatnot, so that, yeah, I didn't mind them on race day.
Particularly if you're lining up sort of 20, 25 gels for your race for one day. You don't want to overdose on them before you actually get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank goodness so many of the gel companies are coming out with all the different flavors. There was one that I really liked, which reminded me of, like the caramel sauce on a sundae at McDonald's. There was one gel that I definitely had a lot of in my Ironmans, and it was like a salted caramel. So I quite enjoyed that one.
Goo do a salted caramel flavor. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yep, I definitely had their salted caramel. Yep.
Did you always stick with what you were sponsored with in your races? Did you have to do that like as a contract thing, or could you use whatever?
Yeah, officially you meant to. Most of the sponsors that I had, and as I said, I was able to handle most things, wasn't super sensitive to changing products. So yeah, I would definitely use some of the different companies I was sponsored by. For a lot of my long course racing, I was with the BMC team, and we did change nutrition companies a couple of times. But yeah, I was able to use their gels, but then sometimes, like I said, just with the different flavors, I used the flasks, the gel flasks. So yeah, it wasn't always noticeable what was in which brand of product you've got in there. So yeah, I did sometimes mix it up and put those salted caramel or something like that, something to look forward to, or just a change on the palate halfway through consuming 20 gels.
So that's on the bike. Do you know what you did on the run?
I don't think it was quite as many grams per hour, but I did consume a lot of my calories from Coca-Cola, from flat Coca-Cola. So that worked for that caffeine aspect as well. And I don't like Coca-Cola outside of racing, but I've had positive experiences with consuming it. And I did enjoy it while I was running in my Ironmans, would look forward to it. So definitely would have that at almost every aid station. I couldn't give you a number of how many grams of carbs I've been consuming because, as you know, plenty of it lands all over you. And occasionally when you get it mixed up with water, it'll land in your eye. But
Coke over the head.
Yeah. So it was mostly gels and Coke. Yeah. And some salt tablets on the run.
It's amazing how good Coke is at that point in a race. Like, yes, it's not a very dietitian approved food outside of endurance exercise, but it's caffeine, it's liquid, it's carbohydrate, it's electrolytes, and it tastes different. So particularly after you've smashed gels on the bike, just that palate cleanser can be super useful.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That flavor of cola at that point, I really enjoyed, whereas I don't really enjoy cola outside of racing. But even now, if I have a sip of cola, it's taking me straight back to the middle of a run in an Ironman.
Oh, no. Good or bad?
Oh, mixed bag. You do that many Ironmans and they're not all going to be good.
Yeah, totally. Did you ever do any solid foods in an Ironman event?
Not as part of a strict part of my plan, but I did after I consumed bananas in those early ones because I was hungry. And then sometimes I would have this feeling of not low in calories, but just empty in the stomach. And, as I said in training, I would eat carrot cake or whatever. And I knew that a banana would be fine to sit in my stomach. If I had that sort of empty feeling, I would grab half a banana and shove it in. But it was never an essential part. I don't think half a banana would really register in the equation of 20 gels.
No, it doesn't touch the sides.
Yeah, but just for that type feeling, I did occasionally grab one.
Did you do any Vegemite sandwiches or anything like that? Very Australian, high sodium?
No, I did Vegemite toast before racing, on the morning of racing, but no sandwiches whilst racing.
Yeah, cool. And what are you doing with yourself now, Liz?
So I'm coaching athletes now, and I'm really enjoying that. I've built that up over the last year. Over 10 years now, I've coached people, but whilst I was racing myself, it was a couple of friends and sponsors and things like that I did on the side. And then after retiring, continued at that level. It was sort of 4 to 5 athletes, and I took up high school teaching. But then about a year ago, I was enjoying the 5 athletes I did have a lot, and just sort of had that thought process that I'm 3 years retired, have a lot of knowledge, and I enjoyed the coaching. So ended up linking up with Tim Reed and coming under his RPG coaching. So yeah, over the last year, I built that coaching business up, stepped away from teaching for now. And it all works really well with my life at the moment. My kids are school age and preschool. So as you know, Taryn, the short days. But yes, I'm coaching at the moment. And that's my main gig, as well as parenting, obviously. And I'm really enjoying the coaching and enjoying being back more and more involved in triathlon. Probably 2 years after I retired of being super involved. COVID obviously hit as well, and there wasn't a lot of races on anyway. So that timing worked well. And as races are picking back up, I'm also finding that fire again to be excited about triathlon, but via my athletes. Yeah.
I do feel a little bad talking to you about triathlon now, like after so many years out of the sport. I wasn't sure whether you'd be like, I don't want to do this, or if you are actually like ready to talk about triathlon again.
No, absolutely. Yeah. As I said, I'm throwing myself more back into it. I'm coaching a few pros now as well and some new pros. So yeah, I'm excited by it again. My age groupers excite me too, actually. They're also lovely and so grateful. And yeah, some that are definitely pushing that pointy end of the age group field too. So they all excite me for different reasons. And yeah, I'm really enjoying it and enjoying being back in the sport, heading to more races. And yeah, I'm happy to be here.
That's good. That's good. Is there anything that you would have done differently? Like looking back on your amazing 18-year career of racing as a professional athlete, is there anything that you would have changed?
Oh, it's funny you asked that. This came up in conversation with my husband, Glenn, literally an hour before this podcast. He works from home as well, and we were just having a quick lunch together. And I don't entirely remember how we got to it, but I was reflecting on things. And obviously, coaching now is very data driven. And I definitely had a bit of data in my program, but I turned professional in 2001 and nothing was very technical. There wasn't data driven processes. And then, you go on through your sport and you're like, oh, it's working. Do I really need to incorporate data? And I did more so throughout my Ironman career, but compared to what a lot of my athletes do these days, it wasn't even that much. So yeah, we were just reflecting on that and wonder how that would have changed things. But yeah, whether or not that technology was around at that time too. I know some of it was, but I was also knowing I was nearing the end of my career and probably a little lazy to indulge in it and spend the time getting to know it.
Sometimes data is power and sometimes data is debilitating. Like obviously you had an amazing career without it. And if it sounds like you understand your body really well and you're in tune with that too. So you probably were really good at communicating that feedback back to your coach to still have the same effect. I find age groupers, no offense guys, are so data hungry and they just get blinded by things, and it completely drives everything they do on a day-to-day basis, and they're probably not that in tune with their actual body and how they're feeling.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And I do try and encourage some of my athletes, especially the ones that are pushing to go pros, to not entirely rely on those devices and those numbers all the time and just get to know your body. So for whatever given reason, and I think being females as well, sometimes our hormones have a role that things aren't exactly as they were prescribed or as you expected. And you need to sort of have that self-awareness to adapt on the run. Obviously, having an 18-year career, I got to know my body really well. I knew that. But as you say, many age groupers aren't in it anywhere near that long, or many athletes in general aren't in it that long. So yeah, there can be this huge dependence on data and devices.
You actually brought up a question. I wasn't going to ask you this, but I know that you raced an Ironman on day one of your period once. Don't know how I know that. But what was that like? And do you have any advice for the females out there where that might happen to them as well?
So for most of my training and racing career, I didn't menstruate and would only really menstruate when I rested each year when I would have my break. So I wasn't really in tune with my cycle and how it would affect my racing, or even kind of aware of like day one blues and, how on day one you generally don't want to do anything. You don't even want to talk to anyone, and let alone go race an Ironman. And so the Ironman that you refer to as racing on day one was my very last race of my professional career. And it was Hawaii. It was Kona in 2018. And it was the end of this 18-year career. And yeah, I tapered enough that my body brought my period back, and it came on race morning. And as a professional or as anyone, you just like, I've done all the work and I'm not going to dwell on this. I just need to get on with things. And I didn't race particularly well that day, but it didn't consume me worrying about it either. And I think part of that was a blessing that I wasn't really in tune with knowing that day one isn't a great day to do an Ironman. Anyway, there's so many given factors that go into any given day of racing, but I'm definitely more in tune with what the cycle can do to your body and to training and racing now 4 years after retiring than I was at the time, because I'm back to regular cycles and understand it more.
Did anyone ever talk to you about that at that time, like not having a cycle and like fixing the situation or anything like that? Was that talked about?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, that started like early in my teens when I got into heavy training. And yeah, my mom and some of my coaches back then, oh God, she made me think a really long way back. But yeah, we definitely looked into things. We tested a few things that were important. I had dietitians check my diet and check that that wasn't an aspect. So we definitely looked into it. And then I think ultimately one sports doctor, she was a female sports doctor and she was pretty experienced. She just told me, I was probably 26. I hadn't been menstruating properly for 10 years. And she's like, look, they come back whenever you rest at the end of each season. Your bone density is going all right, and just try not to worry about it. And I think she was right for the most part, because yeah, when I did retire from racing, I went back to normal cycle and was able to have children and whatnot. But yeah, it was definitely something as a young woman that concerned me. And part of it was that, worry that would I affect being able to have children later.
You obviously have really high energy needs, right? Like having a really high carbohydrate day-to-day diet. Sounds like you've got iron guts and you can chew through heaps of food. You just might have had huge energy requirements that were really hard to meet with your nutrition on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, sounds like it. And the way she described it was that basically the energy I was consuming was just going into repairing the damage I was doing from training and putting on hold non-essential functions. And at that point, reproduction was not essential.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like kangaroos do the same. If they don't have enough food around and they've got a joey in their pouch, they'll actually pause developing that joey. So our bodies are the same. If we don't have enough energy to support ourselves, then there's no way we have enough energy to support growing another human. So it downregulates all of those hormones and things, doesn't produce a lining, so that's not viable. All those sorts of things happen. The body's super smart, but really interesting to hear how much food, fuel, carbohydrate, nutrition during training you consume and still don't have enough energy for that. It's amazing. I think females are so afraid of eating and so afraid that they'll get fat or go too slow and everyone's trying to lean up. But sometimes you need more fuel to stoke the fire in a way. And more fuel is often the answer to fixing people's body compositions in an age group of sense sometimes. And particularly for the elites too. Like the goal is to build muscle mass. We want strong athletes. We want resilient athletes. We don't want like skinny, weak ones, particularly for something like an Ironman at Kona.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like I had this unofficial backed by science theory, but I did see a lot of women with eating disorders throughout my 18 years. And it was quite often those women that had past eating disorders that then later in life struggled with their weight. I would reflect on myself thinking that I hadn't dieted, hadn't calorie restricted, and did have this quite strong metabolism. And I felt like there was a link there. And obviously I'm a sample size of one, but I did feel like there was a bit of a pattern of those women that had that then did later struggle with their metabolism. Is there any evidence to that, Taryn?
I'm sure there is. I don't have any in the top of my brain, but particularly restriction kind of slows everything down. Things don't work particularly well. Like low energy availability affects our entire body system. It's not just menstrual cycle. And it does take a little while to pull yourself out of that in a way. And then as a result, we have this mismatch between what we eat versus what we're burning until it equilibrates again. And like your metabolism does rise as you come out of low energy availability. But sometimes there's a little bit of a gray area in the middle while that fixes itself.
Really interesting field. And I think so many athletes just quite often getting on the wrong side of things.
Yeah. And it's not an aesthetic sport by any means, but we are in our togs or swimmers or speedos, whatever you want to call them, for a lot, like on the pool deck. And historically, body composition for triathlon has been like as light as possible. But now, thankfully, we're seeing this really big shift of building some muscle tissue, being strong, being resilient, particularly for the draft legal events. But even age groupers too, like there's no point being really weak and too lean to the point where you are in low energy availability or running the risk of breaking.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're right. There's comparison to others. And then maybe even that sometimes when you do drop weight, that kind of almost instant running faster. So that can give you this sort of feedback of like, oh, I'm faster, but it doesn't necessarily apply to swim and bike and it's not always sustainable.
So my final question for you, let's not go so deep. Let's get out of the deep. If your kids wanted to do triathlon, would you let them?
Oh, of course I would let them. Yeah. I would encourage them. There would be a point where I'd be like, do you really want to do Ironman? But no, I think the positives that the sport has given me, I would lean into that and help in any way that I could. And hopefully I would be able to give some great help. To be honest, we live in a region that doesn't really embrace elite sport. I'm in Byron Shire and we're a lot more arts based and we have horrible facilities for sports. So I think if my children want to, then it could be tricky in this area.
Particularly with the potholes all over Byron streets and things like that. It's not conducive to road riding, that's for sure.
That's absolutely right. You know it.
I've done that race many a times. Well, thank you so much for spending your afternoon chatting all things triathlon nutrition with me, Liz. I know that you probably didn't really want to spend your afternoon doing that, but we both have to hightail it to kindy pickup, as you said.
Thank you, Taryn.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or want to share with me what you've learnt, email me at podcast@dietitianapproved.com. You can also spread the word by leaving me a review and taking a screenshot of you listening to the show. Don't forget to tag me on social media at dietitian.approved so I can give you a shout out too. If you want to learn more about what we do, head to dietitianapproved.com. And if you want to learn more about the Triathlon Nutrition Academy program, head to dietitianapproved.com/academy. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to helping you smash it in the fourth leg. Nutrition!